Welcome to this lesson on one of the more advanced concepts that you'll have in critical reasonings on the verbal section of the GMAT, which are some common arguments and the stock assumptions that can be applied when evaluating these types of arguments. So let's just consider our argumentation equation. So we talked about this in a prior lesson, and this is going to apply to just how we address argumentation style question tasks on the critical reasoning argument questions, which involve a conclusion, as opposed to the inference questions, which do not. So you'll recall the equation. We've got our explicit objective facts providing some sort of support, known as our premise, and we've got our conclusion that has an explicit subjective opinion that requires support. And in between those two pieces lie the assumption or assumptions, which are your implied unstated fact or facts that must be true to provide your linkage. So the way that the argument tasks work is that your predictions are going to be predicated largely on how you have to address your assumption, regardless of what said assumption actually is. So let's first just consider a strengthened task. So here, what your job is to do is to predict what the assumption is, and then find information in a choice that shows whatever predicted assumption you found is likely to be valid. So that's what you're attempting to do from a theoretical standpoint with a strengthened task. With a weakened task, we're basically looking to do the opposite. So we're going to try to find information in a choice that shows whatever your predicted assumption is not likely to be valid. A flaw task is asking you to find a choice that articulates why the predicted assumption, whatever it is that you've identified, is inherently unlikely. So it's saying that, hey, we've got to assume this thing, and this thing isn't likely to be true reasonably. And lastly, we have our assumption task, which requires identification of information in a choice that is necessary for the conclusion to be valid. And you'll see that that basically matches the way we defined our assumption up here. We said, these are the facts that must be true to link our premise to the conclusion reasonably. So now let's think about our common argument types. So these are the things that you'll actually encounter in life pretty frequently if you think about it, and you see them in the GMAT as well. So you're going to want to note your argument type based on the kind of supporting information that is presented, and we'll talk about the patterns here today in this lesson so that you can hopefully recognize some of them readily and really start to understand the underpinning logic of many of these common arguments. So first is a causality. It just says because A happens, B happens. No exceptions. That is the relationship. Next is what is known as a representative sample. So if you're watching this from, say, a representative democracy, that's a representative sample. You have a small group that represents the interest theoretically of the whole. So that's what you have here as well. You take some subset of a population and then say, hey, this can be extrapolated to a larger population. Then you have what is known as data or evidence interpretation. So you get some sort of, in many cases, like scientific evidence, and oftentimes this comes in the form of numbers, percentages, that sort of thing. And the prompt then proceeds to make a statement about what that data or evidence means from an argumentative conclusion perspective. Then we have an analogy, and an analogy is straightforward. It's a comparison. So it's basically saying that because A is like B, this thing is likely to occur. So that is another relatively easily identified type of argument. And then lastly is going to be a plan or a recommendation. So a plan is saying we're going to do this thing. A recommendation is saying you should do this thing. And these are very similar in structure, and we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail in a moment as well. So the strategic implications here. So why do you want to identify these common argument types? Well, it's hopefully going to expedite the process of elimination by allowing you to identify a prediction that more specifically addresses the supporting information and what the likely assumption or assumptions are because of the way the argument is structured. Do recognize, though, that many arguments can be categorized as more than one type. You don't have to say, well, it's stressful that I got to decide, is this representative sample or data or evidence interpretation, because they can kind of overlap. For instance, if you've got a representative sample of geese that were in a study, you could probably call that either evidence interpretation or representative sample, or you can consider it as both and say, hey, I'm going to look at both of their possible stock assumptions because they each could be relevant to whatever the question task is. And then lastly, recognize that most GMAT arguments, if you're struggling to identify a common argument type, can be reduced to either causality or calling it a plan or recommendation. Either they're an argument saying you should do something or this plan should be enacted, or it's saying that because A happened, B happened. So you can, worst case scenario, in most cases, reduce your GMAT argument to just saying this is a causality, A caused B, that's my assumption, or it's a plan or a recommendation. So let's talk about these individual argument types in greater detail. First, let's start with one of the main ones, causality. A leads to B. So a causality is predicated on the fact that because A happened, B happened. And there are assumptions inherent here. So the causality assumes that there are no possible other causes, that A is the thing that made B happen, there's nothing else that did it, and that the described relationship is not coincidental, meaning that there's not just two things that happen simultaneously and they have nothing to do with each other specifically. So let's take a look at a causality example. So we've got Regina observed her cat coughing at the same time that its water dish was empty. Therefore, Regina supposed that her cat was coughing due to dehydration. So we still, just like we do with all critical reasoning argument style questions, if you recall from one of our prior lessons, we have to identify the conclusion, and the conclusion is that the cat is coughing due to dehydration. That's the conclusion. So now we're saying that no other fact caused that, and it's not a coincidence. So those are our assumptions here. There's no other possible cause for the cat coughing except for dehydration because the water dish was empty, and it's not a coincidence that the cat was coughing at the same time that the water dish was empty. So the way that this would apply to a theoretical question about this is, let's say we wanted to weaken this argument. Well, if we found out that the cat had just coughed up a hairball and was right next to the cat, you might say, oh, the cat is coughing because it was coughing up a hairball. It has nothing to do with the water. There's another possible cause. So that's how you need to address these. You need to think, is there another possible cause or is there not another possible cause? Is it only because of the water dish being empty? So this, the bread and butter of argument types, causality, A cause B, assumes that there's no other possible causes and it's not a coincidence, the thing that we've observed. So then, a representation argument. So representation uses that representative sample that I referred to moments ago to extrapolate to a larger population. And all representation or sampling arguments assume that the sample is representative of the whole and that there is no subtle term shift from the evidence to the conclusion. So let's consider an example here. So you could theoretically have an argument such as 1,000 people in Los Angeles were asked what type of dog they were most likely to purchase, and 97% responded a poodle. Therefore, pet shops in the US should primarily stock poodles. So we're assuming that because of these 1,000 people in Los Angeles who said they're most likely to buy a poodle, that pet shops in the United States as a whole should primarily stock poodles in the hopes that they're going to sell them. So there's our conclusion. U.S. pet shops should primarily stock poodles. And our assumptions, first, is a pretty obvious one probably, which is that Los Angeles is representative of the U.S. So if we wanted to strengthen, we want to show that Los Angeles is indeed representative of the United States when it comes to dog purchasing trends. And if we wanted to weaken, we show that it's not. But there's a more subtle representative sampling issue here, and assumption as well at play, which is that dog is interchangeable with pet by definition. Because if we wanted to be the GMAT and have a really subtle kind of weaken answer. We might have an answer choice if we wanted to weaken this argument that said something to the effect of birds have never been more popular as pets in the United States. And your initial thought may be, well, who cares about birds? We're talking about dogs. But pet, the term, could include birds. And if we find out that birds are more popular than ever, perhaps we don't want to stock dogs at all, notwithstanding the most popular dog, because birds are actually more saleable at this moment. So when you're considering representation arguments, you need to be very aware of subtle term shifts, such as from dog in the evidence to pet in the conclusion, which is also why we recommend that you spend an average of a little, right around 2 minutes, potentially up to 3 on each of these critical reasoning questions, because the details matter here and you really have to read closely both the prompts to identify issues such as this with the term shift and, of course, then the answer choices. So next is a data or evidence interpretation argument. So this is going to use discrete data, scientific data, or evidence to support a hypothesis. Now, you cannot attack the actual evidence. You can't say, well, I know that there aren't 20,000 pygmy elephants left in the wild. There's actually more now. It's changed since they wrote the exam. You're not asked to attack the evidence. You're asked to address the interpretation of the evidence through the assumption. So do not attack the evidence. That requires outside knowledge. It's not going to be required by the exam. But your evidence and data is going to assume that there is no additional data or evidence that would reasonably change the original interpretation presented by the conclusion. So you can address the interpretation. So let's consider another example. So here we've got too much money is spent fighting the Ebola virus. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more flu cases annually. Furthermore, the flu killed hundreds of thousands more than did Ebola last year. So again, even if the Ebola circumstances change now, theoretically the GMAT will, call anything that becomes obviously incorrect based on reality, but you can't be, attacking these specific numbers. But we know that the conclusion is at the beginning. And remember that, again, the conclusion does not have to be the chronologically final statement. It's the thing that is requiring support. And you don't necessarily believe that too much money is spent fighting the Ebola virus until you get the evidence provided further along in the paragraph. So the conclusion is that opinion. Too much is spent fighting Ebola. So our assumptions. Here, it's that there's no additional data or evidence that is available to change the original interpretation that too much money is spent fighting the Ebola virus. So again, to just exemplify what would happen in this sort of scenario, we've got to think about other types of evidence that could be provided about, say, Ebola. So for instance, maybe we have an answer choice that provides information about mortality rate. If we find out that, yes, a bunch more people died of the flu, but the same bunch more people got the flu, well, we don't necessarily have as much fear of the flu if, say, Ebola was infecting 10 people and 9 of them died. I'm probably still more concerned with Ebola, even though the flu had more people who were killed by it, simply because of the mortality rate. It seems much more likely in that hypothetical that Ebola is the thing that is going to kill you if you catch it, whereas the flu, maybe the mortality rate is lower. Similarly, maybe we find out information about mortality age. Maybe we find out that the average person who dies of Ebola, and let's say that it's, again, that smaller subset, is 35, and the average age of a person who dies of the flu is 85. It may then become more apparent that we're concerned with Ebola more because it is killing people in the prime of their lives, whereas if you've got somebody who's dying of the flu at the age of 85, they may really be suffering from concurrent just age-related issues, and that the flu, yes, while it is the official cause of death, is really taking advantage of just a general weakening of the system because of age. So that is how you can consider data and evidence. Another thing to note about data and evidence specifically is if you're given specific numbers, do recognize that this is the GMAT, and you will usually, especially with percentages, have to parse what those numbers really mean, almost in kind of a pseudo data sufficiency way. So you really have to explicitly explore what the information is if you're presented it numerically, even in critical reasoning. So then our next one is an analogy. So again, a relatively simple thing to be able to identify. It's just saying that A is similar to B. So it uses a comparison of a couple of items of items, not items, of items to infer a relationship. And here we just assume that the items are comparable in ways that are relevant. So let's consider another example. So, for instance, we could say that at the turn of the 20th century, the island of Manhattan built a subway system to address transportation needs resulting from rapid population growth. At the turn of the 21st century, Bermuda also experienced rapid population growth, so it too probably built a subway system to address its transportation challenges. So, the conclusion is that Bermuda probably built a subway. That's what's stated. And again, you can't, bring in outside knowledge. We just have to consider that at face value. But our assumption is that Bermuda is like Manhattan in relevant ways. So what we're saying here is that Manhattan's circumstances at the turn of the 20th century is similar to Bermuda at the turn of the 21st century. So we want to find out that there are similar aspects. So again, if we were considering a question task of weakening, we want to show that Bermuda is not like Manhattan in relevant ways. And whether or not it's actually true, if you had an answer choice that said Bermuda is built on a sandbar, whereas Manhattan is built on bedrock, you might not feel so good about Bermuda having built a subway, because that would say that if you try to build a subway in sand, again, you can always infer things that are true worldwide. If you build something heavy in sand, it's just going to kind of sink and move, and that would be bad. As opposed to solid rock, it's going to be static. So again, just a relatively simple assumption that you can apply in a bunch of different ways depending on the task. So then, our final common argument type, which is going to be a plan or a recommendation. So a plan or recommendation presents reasoning for taking a certain action. And many of the ones that we've gone through really has done this. Now, a plan or recommendation argument is the only of our types that has a default conclusion, and that is to execute the plan or recommendation to ... whatever the thing was. You're going to have that as the conclusion, because otherwise the piece is basically moot. If you tell me a plan that you're not going to execute, it's irrelevant, and why are we discussing it? So your default conclusion for all plans or recommendations is that we're going to execute the plan to do this thing, or we're going to execute the recommendation that was provided. Now, the assumption is that the plan or recommendation will work to do whatever it said to do, according to the specifically defined metric of success. And this is important. You can't just say it's broadly good. You have to make sure that the plan does the thing that the plan said it was going to do. So let's consider one more example here. So we have the reintroduction of the wolf to our national park has been a success, but now wolves are preying on many of the other animals native to the park. Therefore, it would be advisable to double the number of hunting permits granted per year to lower the wolf population in the park. So, there's definitely a recommendation. We should double the number of hunting permits. So that's our conclusion. Execute the plan to double the number of hunting permits granted per year. But our assumption is the metric of success, which is that this plan will work to lower the wolf population in the park. And this is important because, again, if, say, we were talking about an assumption, right? What is actually being assumed here? Well, if we had an answer choice that said something to the effect of the revenue from the hunting permits is going to be reapplied back into the park, that's not the right answer. That might be something that seems reasonable, that seems good, but it has nothing to do with the actual plan's goal, which is to lower the wolf population. So you have to be careful when you're considering plans or recommendations to not just choose something that's a broad positive, but something that actually addresses whether or not the plan or recommendation will achieve its specifically stated goal. So these are your common argument types, and if you can recognize them in critical reasoning questions, you'll be better positioned to maximize efficiency and accuracy in your predictions. So let's go over to the whiteboard and take a look at how we can use a common argument in a sample GMAT problem. Okay, so here we've got a sample critical reasoning question, and remember that we always want to begin by setting up our scratchpad A, B, C, D, E for our process of elimination, and we're going to have just our line over top for the task. So we skipped the uh, question stem, and we've got a flaw in the argument regarding the work of Orson Welles. Is that it? So we're just trying to identify a flaw. And we remember from the work that we just did that a flaw means that we need to find info to show that the assumption is inherently unlikely. Now, you're not going to write out this part on the exam, but that's just for our informational purposes only because that's what we need to do with our correct answer choice. And we're going to basically rephrase our statement up here with the paragraph's information once we get the relevant parts. So, the films of Orson Welles are frequently cited as some of the most influential movies of all time, and many fundamental directorial techniques still used today can trace a lineage back to these works. Therefore, aspiring film students should study the work of Orson Welles to best learn the fundamentals of filmmaking. Okay, so always have to identify our conclusion first, and our conclusion, of course, here is the end that says aspiring film students should study the work of Orson Welles to best learn the fundamentals of filmmaking. And we've got a term of should. And should basically means that we're looking at a recommendation. And our recommendation argument type means that our assumption is that the plan will not work. And that our plan will work. But because we're looking for a flaw, we want to show that it inherently won't work. So this is why all of the steps, you got to go through them because you catch yourself like that. Now, what you need to do at this point is just say that our prediction flaw, or PF is just for shorthand, is that the plan to study the OW Orson Welles films will not work to best learn the film fundamentals. Inherently. Because there's some fact that you're like, yeah, that I don't necessarily believe it. It doesn't work. So we then have to go through our answer choices, just comparing them to this broad prediction. So choice A says that the argument does not consider that advancements in modern film technology could render previously fundamental directing techniques obsolete. Well, if the fundamental directing techniques of Orson Welles are obsolete, we probably don't want to study Orson Welles' movies anymore. So this is a reason showing why the plan to study the films of Orson Welles won't necessarily work to study the film fundamentals inherently. And now, when you find a good answer choice that matches your prediction like this, you have license to go a little bit more quickly through the remaining answer choices, but you can't ignore them. So usually we want to be spending quite a good amount of time looking specifically at reasons why to go through these, but if you've got a choice that matches pretty nicely, you can just go more quickly. Here, I'm going to still illustrate why each of the incorrect answers is wrong, but know that here you've got a little bit of license to be, more quickly saying that it requires additional information or is vague without going into the details. But choice B uses the term assumes in hopes that you'll pick it just for that, but that Orson Welles is the greatest filmmaker of all time, that truly has no impact on the argument. It doesn't have to be that he's the absolute greatest filmmaker of all time. That goes beyond the scope, and we don't need that to happen. excuse me, fails to consider the benefits of unconventional directorial approaches to the art form of film. Well, unconventional directorial approaches and consider the benefits. So are they great? Are they not that great? So this needs additional information to really determine if it's something that's necessary. But, and again, if I were just considering unconventional directorial approaches, I'd be like, well, we're talking about the fundamental directorial techniques. That's a term shift that I need more information about. Immediately eliminate that, especially after finding A is a pretty good match to our prediction. D ignores the concerns of the modern film student in constructing a curriculum that would best bring their visions to the big screen. Well, again, ignores the concerns of the modern film student. Well, okay. Do we want to focus on their concerns? I don't know. Does that help us learn with learn filmmaking? I don't know. So similarly, this would need additional information to confirm that it was absolutely necessary. And then require study of a filmmaker from the past who's likely unfamiliar to the modern film student. Well, just because he's unfamiliar doesn't mean he's good, bad, or ugly. We have no idea. So once again, this would need additional information and truly does not match our predicted flaw, nor do any of these answer choices nearly as well as choice A does, which is why it's the correct answer. So here you've seen how to apply our common arguments to one of the most common arguments, one of the two that you can really kind of focus on when you're working through these questions of a plan or recommendation. Look for the others as well. Of course, causality also being one of the common arguments that you can apply to just about every prompt in critical reasoning that has a conclusion, as well as representative sampling, analogy, and data or evidence interpretation. So good luck predicting what the answer should do based on the common argument types you're able to identify in your upcoming critical reasoning practice. Good luck.